Welcome to Man in America. I'm your host, Seth Holhouse. So right now, in my opinion, the most important movement happening in America is the Make America Healthy Again, the MAHA movement, which was spearheaded by RFK Jr. And so as we're watching him potentially and hopefully be confirmed as the head of the HHS, there's a lot of issues that I would really hope that he's addressing very quickly. And of course, what's in the foods is important, the pesticides, what's in the skies, those are all very important topics. But the elephant in the room are vaccines. And not just the vaccines, but the mRNA technology, especially with the recent announcements by President Trump with Larry Ellison, the founder of Oracle, building these $500 billion data centers to have AI technology develop mRNA vaccines to cure your cancer before you get cancer. It's kind of wild, though, because according to a lot of the doctors I'm speaking with, the mRNA vaccines are what's causing the cancer and all the turbo cancer that we're seeing. And so my guest today, Dr. William Makis, who's been a hero on the front line of exposing the cancer industry and also showing how easy it is and how inexpensive it is to treat cancer, is going to be talking about these specific issues. And so we'll be going into what he hopes to see happen with RFK Jr., what he thinks are the most important issues that he thinks that RFK should be spearheading on day one. But also, we're talking a lot about the role of ivermectin and how this horse paste that Joe Rogan was a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist nut job for eating to help him with his COVID, according to William Makis, is actually one of the most potent drugs for dissolving cancer tumors. And so we'll be discussing all this and more on today's show. So folks, please enjoy the interview with Dr. William Makis. For a lot of people, the fear of cancer is also the cost and the treatment, which, my own brother, unfortunately, he passed away at 33. He had a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. He went through radiation chemotherapy and it did nothing for him. It didn't stop the tumor growth. And it was his medical bill at the end of it was over $1 million, right? For his medical bill for his stay in the hospital and the treatment, but it didn't work. But when you look at ivermectin, something that you can like literally walk into Tractor Supply and buy for nothing. I've got a bunch of it stashed away that I went and bought at some point, just to big bottles of ivermectin. And so, what are the findings that you have with ivermectin? How are you using it? What are the success rates, and how is it working to treat cancer? Because if we can demystify this for people, this is knowledge that's very, very powerful in helping people not be so scared of that C word.
Well, I can give you a little bit of background of how this all came about. And you're right. I believe I do run right now the largest ivermectin-based cancer clinic in the world. I've got over 1,000 patients and really with hundreds of requests just pouring in. And I started this clinic in the summer of this past summer, 2024, when I had people coming to me at my live speaking events telling me that their stage 4 cancers were reversing, or that they were cancer-free because they had read a Substack article of mine a year ago talking about ivermectin or fenbendazole or mebendazole. These are anti-parasitic drugs that have been found to have activity in cancer. And then I realized, wait a minute, there are people that are just reading my articles and yet they're being able to halt stage 4 cancer. I should be helping these people along. I should be monitoring them. I should be following them. Maybe I should be publishing about this. And to do that, you have to know these patients. You have to know their background, their history, and follow them. And so I started a cancer clinic in the summer. And actually, one of my early patients was a gentleman in California who said, "Oh, Mel Gibson's one of my closest friends." And I thought, oh, that's nice. And just I carried on. Of course, he had, a very advanced disease and he's done extremely well. And then, you forget about these things, right? And because I have so many patients and to me, every patient is important and I want to see everyone do well. And then this Mel Gibson interview comes out and I see this clip and he's talking about, 3 friends of his that had stage 4 cancers, and then all of them used ivermectin and fenbendazole, some combination thereof, and they're now cancer free. And it just hit me. I'm like, wait a minute, I've treated one of these. I've treated one of his friends, and it just blew up. It just blew up internationally. I mean, the clip was seen at last time I checked, that was at least 30 million views. That clip with Joe Rogan, where I mean, he did a 2-hour interview while his house was burning down, and he did, he brought a spotlight, to ivermectin and fenbendazole as these medications, antiparasitic medications that are now being repurposed and being looked at as cancer drugs. And how did this come about to begin with? I started my Substack at the beginning of 2023, and I started my Substack because I was actually not being allowed back on Twitter. I had been banned from Twitter for raising concerns about mRNA vaccinating children. And at the time, in Canada and the United States, there was a rollout of COVID-19 vaccines in children 5 to 11 years old. And I thought, well, there's going to be an outcry from parents, and this is not going to succeed. And yet, there was such a strong push that a lot of the social media platforms were banning doctors who were raising concerns about vaccinating kids. And, I was banned off Twitter within 5 hours of putting out a post showing that the COVID vaccines had negative efficacy in kids 5 to 11 years old, which means COVID vaccinated children were getting sicker at much higher rate than unvaccinated children. There was a study that had come out. I'd mentioned it. This was a peer-reviewed study. I mentioned it in a post. Within 5 hours, I was locked out of my account, and I was banned for over, well, it was, yeah, for about a year. I was banned for about a year. This was March 2022 when they were rolling out these mRNA vaccines in kids, and other doctors were being banned. Dr. Peter McCullough was being banned, Dr. Robert Malone, and so we were being silenced, we were being censored. And so I started my Substack really as a reaction to being banned off Twitter, and to actually have a voice on a platform that, had freedom of speech on it. This was before Elon Musk, you know, uh, was sort of started bringing everybody back. And during the early days of my Substack, I was looking into the research on ivermectin and seeing, because I wanted to know, well, did ivermectin really work for COVID-19? Or was it, just a horse paste that didn't work as the FDA told us? And all the research I looked at, it was very, very clear that ivermectin was very effective for COVID-19. It's very effective for influenza. It works for influenza H5N1, for example, which we're being fear-mongered with these days as a potential another pandemic. And but there's a whole body of research about ivermectin and cancer, and I'd never seen it before. And so I was reading every article that I could find and get my hands on. And I'll give you one example. There's a few years ago, there was a study done in Mexico by Mexican researchers where they looked at 28 different cancer cell lines. They applied ivermectin to these 28 different cancers, and all of them responded to ivermectin. Now, some of them responded more than others, but they all responded to a certain degree to ivermectin. And the most responsive were ovarian cancer, which is very difficult to treat with chemotherapy. Ovarian cancer, and then, of course, breast cancers, prostate cancers, and then you had, lung, colon, and so on. There are hundreds of studies on ivermectin and cancer. In fact, if you go on PubMed and you put ivermectin and cancer, I think you get a return of something like 350 peer-reviewed studies on ivermectin and cancer. And yet this whole body of research was completely ignored. So I started writing articles about it. And the more articles I wrote on my Substack about ivermectin and cancer, the more questions I got from people coming back saying, well, wait a minute, if this is really so effective in preclinical studies, I'm going to try it. What dose should I try? What dose should my loved one try? My loved one has stage 4 cancer. The doctors have given up hope. They said, we have nothing left to offer you, and they sent them home to die, because a lot of these patients now are being sent home to die by their oncologists, because the oncologists are not allowed to even suggest ivermectin as an option, even when you've exhausted all the chemotherapy options, all the immunotherapy, and they really have nothing left to offer you. And yet there's this huge body of research on various antiparasitics, ivermectin being one of them, fenbendazole being another one.
Here's one right here. I
And
just pulled up. This is on PubMed, on the NIH website, right?
yep,
Ivermectin, a potential anti-cancer drug derived from an antiparasitic drug. And this is from
Exactly.
2020. I'm sure that you mentioned there's hundreds of these things. It says right here, the abstract, ivermectin has powerful anti-tumor effects, including the inhibition of proliferation, metastasis, and it kind of goes on, but basically it's like right here, right? So for a doctor not be able to give you ivermectin for a tumor, yet right here, the first search I did on NIH and PubMed, ivermectin has powerful anti-tumor effects. There's something sinister going on here.
Absolutely. And it's literally hundreds of studies. Now, again, people will point and say, well, yeah, but they haven't done, large human trials and randomized control trials. That may be true. And then you have to ask, but why? Is it because it doesn't work in humans, or is it because there are financial motives to not do the large studies in humans? And it's, of course, financially motivated because ivermectin, I believe Merck had a patent on ivermectin, which expired in the 90s, in the 1990s. And so there was no profit to be had. And so for anyone studying ivermectin in the 2000s or 2010s, well, you're going to have to do it on your own, out of pocket, to study it at all because no one is funding these studies. There's no funding for these studies. And so you've got an antiparasitic drug with powerful anti-tumor effects. You read it right there from one of the studies. And yet it's not being studied because there's no patent on it. No one can get rich off it. The pharmaceutical industry cannot get rich off it. And Merck, which used to hold a patent on ivermectin, is busy developing mRNA cancer vaccines that they can charge $500,000 per treatment, as opposed to what, a few $100s per treatment with ivermectin, which is what it's costing, cancer patients at this point. And so I thought, okay, there's something definitely here. And there's another antiparasitic drug that's really fascinating, fenbendazole. And actually, Joe Rogan ended up reading one of my articles on his show, Substack articles, on his show. This went viral a few months back. And fenbendazole is known as a dog dewormer. It's an antiparasitic that's most commonly used in dogs. So with ivermectin, you've got the horse dewormer, the sheep dewormer, and of course you have FDA saying, hey, listen, you're not a cow, you're not a horse, stop taking that ivermectin, right? And with fenbendazole, you have this dog dewormer or dog medicine, and also an antiparasitic. And yet, when you look at it, has over a dozen mechanisms of action against cancer, including blocking glucose channels on cancer cells and starving the cancer from being able to use glucose as a fuel source. Or, another mechanism is it stimulates the levels of p53 tumor suppressor protein, one of the things that's damaged in people who take COVID-19 vaccines, for example. That's one of the mechanisms by which we might be seeing these turbo cancers. And so it raises the levels of this p53 tumor suppressor protein, which drives apoptosis of cancer cells. It drives the killing of cancer cells. And so you get much more efficient cancer cell killing when you have this drug on board. And it's a safe drug to use. And it was popularized by an American man from Oklahoma, Joe Tippins. In 2017, Joe Tippins was given a death sentence. He was diagnosed with stage 4 small cell lung cancer, which is one of the most aggressive cancers you can have. This is not your typical lung cancer. Small cell lung cancer is rapidly growing, notoriously resistant to chemo. And his doctors effectively said, you've got stage 4 small cell lung cancer. We have no treatment for you. They tried to give him Keytruda, but apparently everyone in that trial died except him. Now, what did Joe Tippins do that was different? Is he had a veterinary friend who told him about this dog dewormer called fenbendazole, and he said, "Look, it was found to cure accidentally to cure tumors in mice that researchers were studying when they gave them antiparasitic to treat their parasites, and then all the tumors that the mice had were cured, and they were upset because they were trying to study those tumors in those mice, and they had accidentally cured those tumors instead, right?" And so his friend said, "Hey, why don't you try it? It's a safe drug," and he did, and he cured his stage 4 small cell lung cancer, and he's still alive 7 years later to talk about it. And so he popularized it. And back then, what was fascinating back then is that his story made the news. It made the local news. There's still clips of it that you can find on Twitter of that local news program that lasted about 3 or 4 minutes, where he got to talk about his story of how he took a dog dewormer and cured an incurable disease, what was doctors called an incurable disease. And they said, you have less than 1% chance of surviving until the next year. And he's here, 7 years later. He popularized fenbendazole. The news covered it at the time. And so that's another one of these antiparasitic drugs that I looked at, started writing about, and then Joe Rogan, pulled up one of my Substack articles on one of his shows, and so you know, there's this whole area of cancer treatment is being called repurposed drugs. And why repurposed drugs? It's drugs that were approved for one use, in this case, antiparasitic use, but you can repurpose them for a different use for cancer, for example. Now, the feature of repurposed drugs is that they're cheap. They are cheap. They're usually off patent. Both ivermectin and fenbendazole are off patent. So there are generics you can buy. You could go right now to IndiaMart, buy generics, and import them into the United States or Canada, and use them, right? Because they're off patent. You don't need a prescription, and they're cheap. They're less than $1 a pill. And so, repurposed drugs are cheap, and yet some of them are very, very effective, but the oncologists are not allowed to use them. And so I have patients from every major large cancer center in the United States. I have patients from MD Anderson, Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins, Dana-Farber, Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York, every large cancer center you can think of in the United States. I have patients who have failed all the chemo, all the latest cutting edge immunotherapy that they received at these big cancer centers, failed all the treatments. I have these patients now, they've come to me. They've come looking for an option, a repurposed drug option. Why do they come to me? Because they went to their oncologist and said, hey, I want to look into using ivermectin. Sometimes they bring a stack of literature, peer-reviewed published literature from, and the oncologist panics and said, no, 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 we can't talk about that. We're not allowed to talk about that, and we're certainly not going to offer it to you. And this is the state of cancer care today, is oncologists are not allowed to even talk about repurposed drugs that are effective in cancer because they're cheap, they're off patent, and they're not in the protocols that the oncologists have. And what are these protocols and guidelines to treat cancer? Well, they come from the American Cancer Society. They come from these large institutions, which are almost completely funded by big pharma. So the only thing that your oncologist is allowed to offer you is expensive chemo, expensive immunotherapy, and coming soon, expensive mRNA cancer vaccines.
Absolutely insane. So looking at understanding how this works. So why is it in terms of the how these treatments do work? Why is it that the anti-parasite, whether it's fenbendazole, ivermectin, why are they able to treat cancer? Are there parasites that are in the cancer cells, or like what is the relationship of it just so happens to be these specific anti-parasite drugs are the ones that are curing stage 4 cancer?
So this is a big unknown. I know there's a lot of theories around the link between parasites and cancer, and some people go as far as saying, well, cancer is parasites, right? Which I don't subscribe to, but I do believe that there must be some sort of a link, and because it is very unusual that there's a lot of antiparasitics that you can look at and you can find literature on cancer, effectiveness in cancer. Now, when it comes to something like ivermectin, they've looked at the mechanisms. Same thing with fenbendazole and mebendazole. Mebendazole is the FDA-approved version, the human version of the dog dewormer drug that ended up costing hundreds of times more than the canine equivalent. Um, they've looked at the mechanisms. And for example, I can tell you a couple of the mechanisms for ivermectin, for example, is ivermectin targets cancer stem cells and kills cancer stem cells, inhibits them. And cancer stem cells are cancer cells that, they're not the cells that are replicating and dividing rapidly and creating the tumors. They're the cells that sort of sit back, hang around, and when the chemo comes, the chemo kills all the rapidly dividing cells and it doesn't touch the cancer stem cells. And then these cells at some point decide to start dividing and they cause recurrence in the future. And this is one of the theories behind why your oncologist usually tells you we cannot cure your cancer. We cannot cure your pancreatic cancer. We cannot cure your stage 4 ovarian cancer or your stage 4 colon cancer. Uh, but we can give you palliative chemo. Well, what does that mean? Well, palliative chemo is chemo that won't cure the cancer, but it will, keep you alive an extra year or 2 years. It'll buy you time. Why? Because the chemo is killing the rapidly dividing cells, but it's not touching the cancer stem cells. And the oncologists know that, and they know they can't ultimately get to those cancer cells. The chemo won't get there. And so they don't have a cure for you. They can only shrink your tumors, existing tumors, but the cancer is going to come back and it's going to kill you. So most of the chemo out there is palliative. It's in very rare cases is chemo curative, and this is in certain leukemias, certain childhood leukemias and lymphomas, so these blood cancers, but solid tumors, chemo is almost always palliative. And yet, ivermectin will kill those cancer stem cells that chemo doesn't. And so it's nicely complementary. And another feature of ivermectin is that it can actually reverse cancer cell resistance to chemo. And so, for example, in ovarian cancer, you will have a situation where they'll treat you with a chemo, and then the chemo stops being effective, and then they'll try another chemo and that stops being effective, and at some point they say, look, we're out of options. Well, what the ivermectin does is it actually acts on a molecular level to remove that resistance or reverse that resistance of that cancer cell, so that that cancer cell now becomes sensitive to chemo again. And so I have patients who are combining ivermectin and chemotherapy, and their tumors are just disappearing. The tumors are melting away and disappearing completely. I have pancreatic cancer patients who are cancer-free after a combination of ivermectin and chemo because of this effect of this reversal of drug resistance. And then you get, this combined approach, and now you're cancer-free because you were able to kill those cells. You know what that means is you turn a problem that is you turn a cancer that's not curable into a cancer that is curable, right? You go from palliative intent to curative intent. And that is something that oncologists are not doing. They're not allowed to even consider the possibility, the option of giving you a cure. Now you wonder, well, why would they cure you? Right? Because I mean that just makes a lot of profits disappear. Like I said, there's no profit in treating you with ivermectin. You can treat a cancer patient with ivermectin as cheaply as about $60 a month. That is the
Wow.
liquid. You talked about liquid ivermectin earlier. Having some liquid ivermectin around. That if you use liquid ivermectin, for example, you can treat a cancer as cheaply as $60 US a month. Well, the pharmaceutical industry is not going to be happy about that. If they're trying to make $1 million off every cancer patient, and you were talking about your brother. Every cancer patient, unfortunately, is looked at by the pharmaceutical industry, by the cancer industry, as money in the bank for them, as someone that they can make $1 million off. And this is the case, for every cancer patient, is that this is profit driven. For them, a cancer patient is $1 million in the bank. And when you look at some of these expensive cancer treatments, or the amount of cancer treatments that a patient has to go through, none of which are curative, that these treatments will not cure you, and yet they will treat you, treat you, treat you until they can't treat you anymore, and then they say, sorry, we have nothing left to offer you. This is what's going to change under RFK Jr., I believe very strongly, that we have to look at curative options, regardless of whether they're profitable for the pharmaceutical industry or not. There are curative options out there. Sure, we have to study them and we have to do those human trials, but we have to fund the researchers who want to do those trials. I want to do those trials, right? I have no funding, I have no support. I'm just trying to help stage 4 cancer patients, give them a potential for a cure. I have no assistance in doing the kind of research that needs to be done. And I really think that RFK Jr. can really shift the focus away from this profit-driven industry and put the patient first. Just like with the childhood vaccines, we should put children first and children's health and well-being first, and not the profits of, the large vaccine makers. We should do the same thing with cancer. We should put the cancer patient first regardless of whether it's profitable for big pharma or not. And I think we have a chance to finally do that.
I certainly hope so, because I can't help but think as we're discussing this, if I only would have known. Like, my brother passed, I think it was 2015, and I didn't know any of this stuff. I mean, I was just, uh, I just had no idea. I'd never come across it, and even, that was, a decade ago, and these discussions weren't being had. And even if I would have
Yeah,
known you 10 years ago, you wouldn't have said, "Hey, Seth, here's a basic ivermectin protocol," right?
I would have
You know,
known. Because
this
I
is
was I
new
was doing
information.
I was doing yeah I was doing cutting edge cancer research at a big cancer center here in Canada. I was publishing. Now I was focused on targeted radiation. How do we deliver radiation to cancer, but in a targeted way where you're attacking just the cancer cell and you're not irradiating healthy tissues, right? And that was my focus of my research. But I didn't know about repurposed drugs. I didn't know about ivermectin. I didn't know about fenbendazole, mebendazole, and yet this research was already there. The preclinical studies were already there. I never learned about it. I didn't know about it, right? And oncologists, I can tell you, when I have patients come to me from these large cancer centers, and some of them say, "Look, I told my oncologist, hey, what about ivermectin?" And the oncologist either panics and says, "No, no, 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 don't take that horse medicine because it's going to, destroy your liver or destroy your kidneys," which is a complete lie. These are safer than your Tylenol, than your Advil. Ivermectin has 100 times fewer safety reports, I believe, than Tylenol. And so, the safety profile is very, very favorable. And yet the oncologists will either say that they'd never heard about it, or they'll throw out some lie like, "Oh no, don't do that. That's dangerous. That's dangerous, right? Here's chemo that will literally destroy your bone marrow and destroy your healthy cells and may give you a few months of extra life. No, no, that's safe and effective. But ivermectin and horse paste, though, heaven forbid, you take that, God knows what might happen. You might actually cure your cancer and cost the pharmaceutical industry $1 million, right? So they don't know. The oncologists don't know. And what's shocking is that, there's a lot of things I don't know, but I'm willing to learn. And I've been willing to learn over the last few years about ivermectin and these repurposed drugs. These oncologists, they don't know and they don't want to know. They don't want to learn. There is no there's no interest there, and there's no attempt to learn about this. And I think part of it is because the culture is so toxic. The culture in oncology is so toxic, is that there is no creative thought. There is no, hey, how can we offer this patient a cure in this incurable cancer? This stage four pancreatic cancer is supposed to be incurable. I have patients who are now cancer free. I have a cholangiocarcinoma patient who was told in the spring, by the summer, you'll be dead. And she comes to one of my live events about a year later after she was supposed to be dead. And she says, "Hey, Dr. Makis, I'm alive because of you." And I said, "What are you talking about?" She's like, "Oh, I sent you an email and you sent back some 2 lines saying, hey, look at ivermectin and fenbendazole and this." And she took some on her own and she's alive a year later. And then I took her on as a cancer patient. A few months later, she was cancer free. Her oncologist told her, "You'd be dead by summer. Next year, she's declared cancer free." Right. And yet the oncologist, she can go back to the oncologist. The oncologist won't even ask the questions. How are you, still alive? Why are you still alive? What are you taking? The oncologist doesn't want to know. They don't care.
Wow. Which is why these conversations are so important, and why your Substack, which I'll pull up again, Makis MD, it's Makis MD.substack.com. This information is so important because it's not about, say, going against big pharma or anything. It's just about doing what it takes to make sure that we can live. Because I look at the massive hole left in my life from not having my brother and my best friend. I'm thinking, gosh, he'd be raising kids next to me. He'd be doing. There's this big hole there that would have been filled by him if I would have. Obviously, God has His own arrangements, and I trust that. So I don't look back with this immense regret. But I just think, gosh, how many people have lost loved ones because they didn't have this information. So I thank you, like, with such a sincere graciousness. I thank you for doing what you're doing, and getting this information out. And I encourage anyone who's watched this interview to share this information, because we have to get this information out, because there are people dying every single day. There are people that are contracting new forms of cancer. They're having cancer come back with all the medication, all the mRNA stuff that's going on. So we have to get this information out. And again, thank you for doing what you're doing to do that, because this is so important for the future of our human race.
No, thank you. I appreciate you having me on. And one last thing I just wanted to mention is that one of the many things that I love about RFK Jr. is that he really wants to change things for the better. He wants to change the culture of medicine and science and so on. And one of these potential changes, he talked about this fairly recently, is that medications that patients use in the United States should be manufactured in the United States, of course, with all the safety measures, quality control measures, and so on. And when it comes to something like ivermectin, fenbendazole, mebendazole, these are repurposed drugs that patients are having to smuggle into United States from the manufacturing countries like India, which manufactures most of the generic drugs. And so patients are, and I've had to do this myself, for my family, I've had to do it for some of my cancer patients, is I have to put in an order because people always ask me, what's a good source for ivermectin in the United States, Dr. Makis? Well, I can't give you one, or if I give you one, it's 10 times or 100 times more expensive than what you can find in these pharmacies in India, for example. And so patients have to place orders for these, in these pharmacies in India. And then sometimes their package gets confiscated by customs, and customs opens it. And you know what they do? They say, well, you can't have this. We're going to send it back, or we're going to confiscate this. And so, it's almost this communism style, situation where, in communist countries, you had to smuggle in drugs from Western countries, basic drugs like antibiotics, and they were sold on the black market. And that is the situation we have with ivermectin. Dr. Mary Bowden, the Texas doctor who stood up against vaccine mandates and talked about the dangers of the vaccines and was also persecuted for it by her medical board, by the Texas Medical Board. She put out a poll recently on Twitter and she asked people, where do you get your ivermectin in the United States? And over 50% of people said Tractor Supply. This is ivermectin paste, veterinary paste, that people go to Tractor Supply to get to treat, various conditions, but to also treat cancer. That's unacceptable for a country like United States. United States should lead in repurposed drugs. It should lead in drug manufacturing. It should lead in availability of safe drugs for cancer or various things. I mean, something like ivermectin should be available over the counter. It should be available over the counter. It's got a safety record of 4 decades, over 4 billion doses given, an extremely favorable side effect profile with minimal side effects. And yet Americans are having to order these generic drugs in India, having to smuggle them into the United States, hope that it doesn't get intercepted by, an overzealous, customs agent. And this is the situation we're at right now. And so RFK Jr. has said, listen, we got to make these drugs in the United States. And I think that's another thing that he could spearhead in his position. I hope he gets confirmed. I believe that he has the votes needed to be confirmed, and we are looking from other countries like Canada, communist Canada. We're looking with a lot of hope and optimism to the United States to lead us out of this dark age of medicine and just the pharmaceutical industry doing everything for profit to an age where we can actually put patients first and do what's best for the patient.
Well, it's kind of crazy. I just had a conversation yesterday with Dr. Orlando Silva, who's also someone that was, from Cuba, so fled a communist country, came to America, then and he was an oncologist, and he became, he then realized, oh my gosh, the medical system has become communist. And he was telling me it's actually a funny story that a lot of times when he gives someone a script for ivermectin to go in and get it, they won't give it to them. And so what he started doing is he would call in the script and he'd say, look, my patient has a parasite infestation and I'm worried that, like, make sure they're in and out quickly because it's spreading quickly, and he'll tell the patient to go into the, CVS or Walgreens and be itching and act really nervous as they're getting their script, and he says sometimes the pharmacist will run it out to the car, like, and quickly give it to them and run back because they're so scared, and so, like, these are the tactics that he's having to
Yes.
resort to enable people to actually even go into their CVS and get a doctor's script for ivermectin. It's crazy.
It's crazy, but these are the tactics that people used in communist countries,
Yeah,
right? And he's familiar with these things where you have to, you have to lie and you have to be creative about it. And like I said, in communist countries, people had to sneak things in and trade it and sell it on the black market and so on. Uh, I think the United States has to lead the world
yeah.
in exploring repurposed drugs, researching repurposed drugs, and making them available for cancer patients because we have a huge explosion of cancer. I believe a lot of these cancers are turbo cancers. I see them in young people who've had COVID-19 vaccines. They were mandated COVID-19 vaccines, so there's been mandates that are behind this cancer wave. And we have to make these repurposed drugs. We have to make them in the United States. We have to make them available over the counter. Ivermectin, fenbendazole, mebendazole, whatever the antiparasitic or whatever the drug may be that has uses, it should be made in the United States and it should be made available.
I agree. I agree. Well, Dr. Makis, thank you again. It's such a pleasure speaking with you. And I'll bring up just one last time your Substack. I highly encourage people to go there, sign up. I think I've got a paid subscription for you. It's a way of supporting, which you can do. Also, the information's out there for free. And aside from your Substack, is how can folks get a hold of you if someone has cancer and they're concerned and they want to have you help them? How can they do that?
Well, people can reach out to me at my email, makisw79@yahoo.com. I've been extremely busy, especially since the Mel Gibson interview. My email has just exploded, but I've got some help, and so if you've got a really bad situation, you feel free to reach out to me. And people can also follow me on Twitter at MakisMD, and of course my Substack, makismd.substack.com.
And so the email, can you repeat your email one more time for folks?
makisw79@yahoo.com. And be very careful because there are now over a dozen scammers on Facebook, on WhatsApp. They're stealing my picture. They're using my picture. They're trying to get people to give them money. They're pretending they're selling ivermectin or whatever the situation may be, even offering consults. There was one website that had an beautiful picture and my whole history, and I was looking at where's this address leading to, and it was like a port in Nigeria. And so you have to be extremely careful because unfortunately there's a lot of scams out there. So please be careful with the scams. I have only one email address, and that's makisw79@yahoo.com.
Great. Well, Dr. Makis, thank you again. It's great speaking with you.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.